We're here at Antigua Forum with Guillermo Peña Panting. And Guillermo, you're from Honduras and you're also heavily involved in Honduran society. And one of your roles is founder of Fundación Eléutera. Can you tell us what the foundation does and why you felt it was important to create it?
Well, the story goes back to the final year in university. So I guess around 2005, I was interning at an organization called the John Locke Foundation in North Carolina. And we had a really interesting case where we were able to show through civil society organization, I guess, and through real investigative journalism on how a governor at the time was doing things not right. And that was sort of the straw that convinced me that we were able to do things and change and reform and put pressure on the system from outside of politics, or from outside of formal politics, let's say, party politics. So I went back home in 2006 and immediately I got connected with the Atlas Network in DC and with Giancarlo Ibarwan down here, and that was how things got started and rolling. I tried looking for some organization that was doing this in Honduras, and I never found one. So we said, if you don't find someone doing it, you kind of have to do it yourself. So that's how the story got started. But we failed twice before we were able finally to get a think tank going. And that was about 3 years ago that we finally got it going, and it's been a pretty successful story so far. We have a small organization, but we've done a lot of and participated in some pretty big reform, especially this past year. We did in the tax reform for the tax code that was being totally flipped around, and we had a good participation on that. We've done work on labor reform, on the flexibilization for working hours, and as well as on the energy market and on the education system. So.
You've also been involved in the ZEDE reform. Can you tell us what that is and sort of how was the idea behind it born?
So I came a couple years into the idea, but around 2010 and 11, when the Honduran government was still recovering from the previous 2009 episodes, which they kicked the president out, the institutions were so weak. Attractiveness to the country for investment was absolutely none at the time. There was limited recognition from other governments. So the opportunity came up, and these are just things that happen out of chaos or out of a crisis, or it could happen out of a hurricane. It could happen out of a political crisis. And at this time, it was probably the weakest point the government had in many years. And a creative idea showed up and said, let's try out small areas with big reform or total reform and see what happens. And at the time I was working for the private sector organization at the Umbrella Organization, and saw this started to happen, and I figured, being someone who'd been involved in public policy, there's two ways. There was two ways into my life there. It was, should I keep pushing for piecemeal reform or patchwork reform, for the next 45 years, and hopefully it'll work, or let's try to get this right. And if we get this right, we might have to we might have done it in 5 years instead of 45. So we chased that one privately, never as a government official. And we were able. The UFM had a gigantic role in the initial part of this. In fact, Antigua had a brilliant meeting with people that really got our ideas together, that we were able to craft out the first legislation. And after that, we kind of just stuck to it, and now I'm at the point where I lead a private development group for one of the attempts to start one of the zones.
And it's a quite radical reforms in some ways. So what have been the biggest challenges both in implementing it and for the future?
We thought initially the biggest challenge was going to be politically, but at the time, even though there were some weak institutions during the Lobo administration, which is the previous one before this, there was a really strong presence from that party in government or in Congress. So the reform was able to pass actually pretty well, and with the support of all 5 parties at the time. So that wasn't really the problem. It was more of a public perception problem, and then it was more of a internal learning curve problem. Nobody had tried this way. Nobody had set up an administration this way to supervise these type of projects. Nobody has funded a project like this privately. Our closest examples were Songdo in Korea, or Sandy Springs in Georgia, or some of the free zones in Dubai. But those were, the Dubai model and the Korea model had heavily government funds. Sandy Springs is more of there was something already there, and it was a community based. They didn't have to do some of the things that we have to do on policy reforms, such as how will banks operate when we are not under the regulation of the National Banking Commission inside the zones, or health, or customs, so these are more national level institutions that we were able to modify, but there was no real model to chase after. So it was a lot of let's basically read, talk to people, visit countries, visit projects, and try to see what we think would be a viable product to get this going. So I think a lot has been learning, and then from learning, what are the rules to get this started, and getting the rules started, or getting the system that had to set up the rules, that has been the really long part. And I think that a lot of people have sort of gotten tired of the story not moving forward, but we've never stopped working. We just kind of took it out of the media and took it out of the public debate, because it really didn't help. People get anxious and start, when a project so complex as this one, people start imagining many things, and when they do, public perception starts changing usually into negative forms that don't really help. So we just kind of went quiet and continued working.
Another project you were involved in that also got a lot of media attention, and I understand mostly positive, was a land title registry based on blockchain technology. Can you explain in a simple way what that was, and why does Honduras or you feel the need to develop that?
That was another. So the ZEDE legislation and the conversations that we had to have were so, there was a big creative element on setting things up like nobody had before, and also setting things up in which you can create trust, and not only for residents but for investors and for the outside people who are just looking in. And the land title for blockchain was what we as private developers said, how are we going to run our land title system? And that conversation, along with the government people, said, this is our solution for the problem, because currently in Honduras there's been traditionally a weakness of protection for land titles, so we looked around for solutions and ended up bumping into some blockchain industry people and said, do you guys think this will work? And they said, absolutely. In fact, that's what we want to try to do. We think that's a huge market, and we'd like to try out if there's a possibility for in the zone for him. But the zone turned into a national project, because it was the same project there that we had the problem, and we tried to work quietly. Then again, there was we would prefer to stay out of, even if it's nice to get some good praise from big media that you would otherwise never get onto. And in this case, having a front cover on The Economist on the project, mentioning Honduras as a country looking forward and into technology that nobody else has applied. And it's not the typical article that Honduras had been in the last couple of years on The Economist. So that was good. But on the other side, that brought in a lot of attention, and some of the not the top level government officials, but a bit lower down, they got scared, and the project got stalled at the end. But the idea was using blockchain technology, which at the end, in very simple ways, is software to protect data. So what we would do is start a standardized process for registering property titles, bringing down where there was fault or risk, or to pinpoint those areas in which we could then record as each step went through, from the time the notary or the client, the person registering his title, sends in the notary papers, to the time it comes out at the other end. So we had to have a very clean process on how that would work. And what blockchain does is allows you to keep a ledger, a protection of data, and file after file, and who touched it at what time and from what department and were they allowed to, and then it comes out in a cryptographic hash. So that's how we planned on doing it. We had some extremely interesting support from the World Bank. We ended up presenting the project at the World Bank Land Conference last year, and that brought attention that we just did not expect. But it was good attention that told us we were doing the right thing. So I think we might have stalled for a bit right now, but I bet within the next 12 to 18 months, between 1 and 5 countries around the world are going to start a blockchain for land title project.
It seems like Honduras is home to a lot of experimental reforms. It's the ones you mentioned, and also education reform. And you said that part of that was because there's some chaos in Honduras and there's a lot of hard problems that you're struggling with, but a lot of other countries are struggling with the same problems, especially developing countries. So why do you think Honduras is doing so many experimental things?
I think this administration, which had a lot to do with the previous administration, so it was a continuation process. There were some key people, key decision makers, who were able to talk about things practically and reform practically, and they had already tried reform when the National Party was previously in government in 2002, 2006. And there were reforms that for one reason or another were then manipulated, and corruption came into that institution, or where they didn't stick. So they had seen the failures of some initial reform, and learned a lot from it. And I think it was stars aligned for us that for Fundación Eléutera, that we were trying to do some reform without being a big, long-standing institution with credibility, but there were some people willing to listen, and they were big decision makers, and I think that in policy there's windows that open up, and there's the right people at the right time, and I think I don't know if we'll have that opportunity in the next administration, but so far we've had it for these last 4 or 5 years, and we've been able to pitch in, and I think that's how homeschooling is now a legal form of education in Honduras. So as unschooling, as some Thule schools now have gotten started in Honduras. Now we're looking into the process of execution of some of those reform, and like I said, it's you can't plan for it. You just have to have the right people, have the right relations, and build the right trust. It was big for us that they trust us and they take our opinions, and not all of them stick, but some do.
Thank you, Guillermo.
It's a pleasure.